Hi all, I have another fascinating and instructive game to show you today. Vladimir Kramnik, a really superb world champion and class player against Alexei Shirov, a world title challenger on many occasions, and very dynamic, aggressive style of play. So this is a mega clash in 1996 in the Vienna Millenium tournament, round 1, and let's see what happened here. Knight f3 from Vladimir Kramnik. Shirov plays d5. d4, we have c6. So Shirov not fianchetting the bishop. He's aware that Vladimir is very strong against King's Indian style positions. And black elects for the moment for a light square grip strategy. A solid kind of fortified position on the light squares. So knight c3, and we have a6, the Chebanenko Slav. So this does enable black to have a solid position, but maybe also to play aggressively later. It is also a provocation, saying to white, come and get me with c5, which is a very popular move here. And c5 is actually played. It tries to create a bind. It looks very lucrative to try and create a bind on these dark squares, and it looks as though it's going to be difficult for black to ever actually achieve e5, especially if there's a bishop coming to f4. We have a strong dark square grip, which would seem to be the outcome here. After c5 we have bishop f5, queen b3, and now rook a7. Another alternative here is actually queen c8. This has also been seen in quite a few games. After bishop f4 and the knight going to d7, knight bd7, white has a small edge here. But rook a7 looks fun as a way of protecting b7. We have bishop f4. So is there a slight micro downside of white's setup here? It seems entirely logical to grip these dark squares. And where are black's pawn breaks going to come from? b6 and e5 seem really under white's control. Well, knight bd7 was played. We have h3 giving the bishop a retreat square, and black complements that move by kind of imitating it here for this bishop to have a retreat as well. We have e3, and now the first sign of aggressive intent from Alexei Shirov. He lashes out here with g5. If instead e6, this does seem maybe more stable, but if the queen drops back, which could be useful for bishop d3, it's hard to see how this position would give winning chances actually to either side, especially after knight a4, for example. This is going to be tricky to win this. It's about even here. So g5, very aggressive move. Bishop h2, so some imbalances are being created. Shirov is wanting to play for a win with the black pieces here. Bishop g7, and then we have knight e5. This is moving a piece twice in the opening. Generally, it's like, well, it's only a kind of beginner's rule, right? So Vladimir Kramnik's allowed to do that. But maybe bishop e2 is safer if both sides castle. And with the move queen d1, there's a key move for bishop d3 later. It should be just even. This position doesn't seem to carry too much issue for either side, actually. So anyway, knight e5 was played, and black castles. And now, adding a little bit more controversy, f3. White's being really ambitious here, indeed, to potentially play for e4 later. f3 is creating some potential dark square weaknesses. When pawns are on light squares like this, the adjacent dark squares are a bit weaker. The dark squares are kind of occupied, though. Can they actually be undermined literally, these dark square pawns? And, for example, this whole diagonal becoming weak, or this diagonal becoming weak. It's very interesting, f3. It seems fundamentally maybe a bit shaky. If bishop d3 instead, then if knight takes, bishop takes f5. So what does black do? Because that does offer the swap of bishops. If e6, knight takes, queen takes, this position white should have a small edge here, it seems. That might be a safe way to play things. So f3. Okay. Now Shirov actually simplifies. Knight takes e5. Bishop takes e5. Does that actually improve things for black or worsen things? It depends. If these pawns are going to be a liability later, you need pieces around generally to kind of support and protect them and nurture them, like an extended garden or something, maintaining property or something. If these pawns are going to become weaker, maybe that is going to be through the exchange of pieces, looking after them. So it's very interesting, that exchange, and knight d7 now exchanging off even more. So bishop takes, king takes. So we have this kind of architecture which is being neglected by white's pieces, but white still has very aggressive intent. The whole point is now revealed. e4. It's so ambitious from Vladimir Kramnik. He's pushed so many pawns forward here. Queen d1 again seems to be a safe idea. For example, e5, bishop d3, just to challenge this very nice piece for black with that bouncy retreat, queen d1. It seems as though white should have a small edge here. But e4 was played, and now d takes, f takes, and the bishop drops back to g6. And it looks as though black's the observer of this kind of building structure, and it just needs to be collapsed. White castles queenside. If e5, it seems that would open up that bishop, and maybe here a collapse can be created with b6. This doesn't look too healthy for white, this structure. It looks like d5 is a nice blockade square. The b file is going to be dangerous. The bishop's dangerous on that diagonal. It looks very unpleasant. So anyway, white castled queenside here. And now, guess what Shirov played in this position to try and bring about a collapse of the white center. Okay, if I give you 5 seconds to pause the video, what would you play? Okay, e5. It's a very logical looking move to try and undermine this pawn chain. And with the absence of any dark square bishop, white is kind of fundamentally weaker along that diagonal and this diagonal. We see queen c4. If d5 here, as an example, then knight takes c5 hits the queen. And this is mostly pointless. Black's just winning material. If d takes e5 instead, trying to pin the knight, black can rebel against that pin with knight takes c5 hitting the queen here, and if rook takes, then black is winning the exchange there. So this is a very, very unpleasant looking undermining move, e5, justifying black's whole provocation, in fact, it seems, earlier. We see queen c4, and now a very incisive looking move is played here, not just trying to undermine, but also celebrate this diagonal. Shirov plays queen f6, so putting more pressure on the structure here, but also reserving the right for queen f4, which also looks at e4 being vulnerable. Queen e7 is looking less accurate, it seems. If, for example, like this, it seems maybe black still has a small edge. It might not be that bad, but it is pretty unpleasant for white already, even with queen e7. But queen f6 really seems a powerful idea. We have d takes. Here, if d5, then c takes d5 and queen f4 check. And you can see that weakened diagonal is very unpleasant after knight f6 gaining a big tempo against the queen, and e4 is crumbling. Bang, bishop takes e4, big advantage. So d takes e5 was played, knight takes, and white has this isolated pawn now. Black has a lovely e5 blockade square. The rook comes back with its fellow rook. Hello, hello. Queen e3, rook a8. And now it plays an active role to try and challenge that central file. Bishop e2, queen e7, rook he1. And now the knight retreats, looking at c5. We have check. If b4 was played here instead, then maybe black undermines with a5. And this A file could be useful, for example, like this situation where the A file becomes dangerous for white's king, and the E5 knight looks after D7, so black's king safety is actually pretty good. This is very unpleasant, the queen looking at things like B3 here. It looks very unpleasant indeed for white. So queen D4 check. The knight actually goes back for a moment, and it looks at the queen, it hits the queen. So the blockade is actually replaced by the queen now, since white has been stubborn. But these pieces are all looking at the common square E4. Bishop F3, and now H5, as though G4 might be on the cards. White plays A3, welcoming perhaps G4. If G4 had been played instead, perhaps black just closes down with H4. And then this situation, for example, looks as though knight D5 is eventually going to be on the cards, with that nasty pinned pawn being exploited. And black's going to end up winning material in the center like this, for example, with a devastating advantage, a winning advantage. So it looks as though, yeah, white can't really afford to do nothing. So G4 doesn't really do much. So A3 is played. By the way, in that line, just let's review that line again just for a moment, if you're a bit cynical about it. If instead of bishop F3, if rook takes D8 and the knight retreating, rook D4 is going to be dangerous. For example, like this, and black's going to have a nice position where the infiltration with the queen could become an issue in this variation, with E4 crumbling anyway. So it starts to look precarious. So A3 was played. We have rook Fe8. G4 was actually, it looks like a tempting forcing move, and you might think rook takes, and black's king could be questioned with rook H1, threatening queen H6, and then queen H8. It turns out here king F8 might actually be interesting for black. This position is actually rather nice for black. But that wasn't tested, so we just have rook Fe8, not the forcing move G4. Rook takes D8. Rook takes D8, bishop D1, and now we have an invasive rook D4, not just looking at E4. This is a combine and win, really. All the pieces combining on E4. But also the rook reserves the right to combine on C5 as well, so both these pawns on both the light square and the dark square. This whole structure doesn't look like it did earlier in the game. It looks to have been undermined successfully. Bits are going to drop off. Surely, bishop c2. If b3 is played, can you see what black could do here, which is tactically justified? Certain players might not entertain an exchange sacrifice, but here an exchange sacrifice does seem to do quite a lot of damage to extend black's advantage. It's robbing white's king safety even more, and the upward trend for black is clear here. For example, bishop takes, there's takes and check here, and then bishop g6, skewing the queen against the king, pinning the queen against the king. So this looks like a devastating exchange sack possibility. Let's look at that again here. Instead, if king b1, knight d2 check, and check, and mate. And if bishop c2 on move 32 there, then queen a1 check and knight c3. And this is all pretty devastating stuff, basically. So the exchange sack would be well worth it. So bishop c2 was played, though, not b3. And we have now rook c4. So putting pressure on c5, and there's no b4, c3 would drop. So c5 really has been undermined. And it's just a wonderful position. I don't think there's too many games where Vladimir Kramnik has been positionally destroyed like this, with a lovely blockader just removing any counterplay he has, and he's just starting to lose pawns. You would imagine it's Vladimir Kramnik on the black side against some GM opponent. But here, yes, he's losing c5, and after rook c4, it looks as though, yeah, he's losing e4 as well now. It's a real dismantling of white center. So rook takes e4 is played, and the game ended here. If he continued, white could even lose g2 basically after rook takes e4, queen takes check, and then queen takes g2, and there's no problem there either. Black's just loaded material up. So I'll take you to the game end position. So what do we see in this game, philosophical points about this whole system? Well, first of all, there is some commentary from Shirov himself regarding this game. He actually mentioned when he learned he would be playing Kramnik with black, he was not especially confident because the memory of how he lost to in Dortmund without getting out of the opening was still fresh. Therefore, he chose a setup involving some risk, but which the chances to safely reach a middle game fight was still very good. So he says he returned to the Chebanenko system, which he played a lot during 1993 to 1994, so that's 2 years before this game, scoring 3 out of 4. So yes, he already had a great confidence in this opening system, the Chebanenko with a6. So yeah, he kind of likes the system, is one of the exponents of this system. And what we see is the overextended centre and white going a little bit too ambitiously to kind of play knight e5 and then f3 and e4, putting even more pawns to be exposed. The kind of e5 collapse, creating the blockade square on e5, making c5 a bit weaker, making e4 a bit weaker. Black didn't really seem to have too many issues, either with king safety or any pawns exposed. It was white really that was being undermined throughout, it seemed, from this game. So as a kind of provocation tool for provoking weaknesses, it seems the whole a6 did a good job here of provoking white to overextend the centre and create lots of exploitable weaknesses later, which a tactical player, especially like Shirov, is going to be able to tap into profitably. Okay, so I hope you got something from it. And if you want to check out a free short and sweet course on this system, there is a link here, Kingscrusher TV /ChebSlav. If you want to check that out, a really fantastic short and sweet course by Kolovich, Grandmaster, who's very, very enthusiastic about the whole setup. Okay. Comments, questions, likes, shares, subscribes with the notification bell, always appreciated. Thanks very much.
Chess is an exercise in awareness. It is evolution in motion. I evolved. This is where I am today. I like the feeling of strength that the pawn on d5 gives me. It feels like building a castle, a fortress. Pawn goes to d5. It is supported by its brother on c6. Knight comes to f6 for more stability. Bishop goes out to f5 as a guard outside the gates. Eventually, the pawn on e6 forms a triangle for the safest pawn structure in the center. It gives me confidence for the upcoming battle. This is the Chebanenko Slav.